So you can start off by telling us about yourself.
All right. Well, thanks to the Africa Transitional Justice Network for inviting me. There are so many things I can say about myself, but since we do not have too much time, I would just say specifically things that I think is related to my work and who I am. So I'm Aaron Weah. I was a young kid when the Liberian Civil War started, just about finishing university. The year I finished turned to overlap with the Liberian peace agreement. During this period, I got involved. Transitional justice just got introduced to Liberia, and I got involved. Now, someone listening to me would say, what is important, with this timing. So, from the onset of the Liberian conflict in 1990, I was a kid staying with my parents, and they sheltered me. So, by 2003, about the time I was about to leave university, Liberia had signed yet another peace agreement. It was the 14th peace agreement. And I was in university with some friends, and we thought just about leaving, we thought that this is the 14th peace agreement. It means we've had 13 other peace agreements that have never worked. And we've come of age, we're young men now leaving university. Why if this peace agreement doesn't work? So we took this as a challenge. Two other colleagues and I, we started ambitiously thinking through Liberia's complicated history, and by 2004, 2005, we decided we were going to write our account of the Liberian Civil War. And so we set out and I wrote a book. I mean, it's interesting that three young colleagues from university writing a book. One of my colleagues had a bachelor's degree in engineering. I had a degree in management and accounting. Wow. The other colleague had a degree in electronics engineering, even though he later on went to do accounting as well. So you see our preoccupation, 2004, 2005, it was more about, are we turning the corner? Are we moving away from the war? And so we wanted to have our say. And we didn't want to be inhibited by our individual disciplines. I mean, we were asking social science related questions. But here we were, I came from a business school. My other colleague came from the engineering college, and then we went and wrote. I mean, the reason I'm mentioning this is really the evolution of me in transitional justice. That writing process, that thinking process into Liberia, very complicated history. And I will go a little more into that history at the next set of questions. For me, it really gave me an epiphany as a young man, moving on into life and saying, this may not be over. A few years ago, I was just a kid living with my parents, and they sheltered me. Now I'm on my own. Would the role of me looking after my parent be reversed? If this peace agreement didn't work, what would I be? So there was a lot of anxiety that went into this book, and it was a very emotional writing process. So with this peace agreement, I had my first job, and the first job wasn't a job that took me to a bank or took me in a corporate setting, which is really I was prepared for to work. I got to work in civil society, and from the get-go, I got involved with the process leading to the drafting of the TRC Act. And then I was at Parliament at the legislature campaigning for the TRC Act to be passed into law. So from the very onset of Liberia transitional justice history, I got involved out of a curiosity that we're having a fourth peace agreement. Will the peace agreement work? Why if it doesn't work? So this process from university with some of my colleagues really kind of prepared me, gave me the intellectual curiosity to start tinkering where Liberia was, where it was headed. So I thought, see a little bit of myself. I mean, this is really what I am now and what I was then.
Oh, wow. I think that's really interesting because there's general consensus, or not consensus, but idea and perception that for you to be involved in transitional justice, you're coming from sort of a social science background. But what you're revealing is that the work of transitional justice sort of, I suppose, comes to you based on your memories, based on your experience of conflict, and that doesn't make you devoid of the same feelings, the same emotions. Discipline is discipline, but experience is another thing altogether. Oh wow, that's so. I'm definitely. I just learned something new right now. And so, based on this sort of evolution that you've experienced in your time developing the book, your time drafting the transitional justice processes in Liberia. What have been the biggest challenges for human rights, for justice, and for transitional justice efforts today in Liberia, in that region as well?
Yeah, I think this is a very good question. And I mean, looking back at my experience, looking back at where the process started, where it initially took off, and where it has been torpedoed, I would say. And now we're dealing with the major roadblock that I see not just in Liberia, but next to Sierra Leone and elsewhere is the continuity, the issue of continuity between
Mm,
what started off as a TRC process and how they transition from one government to the next. So what we are dealing with, what I think are some of the main challenges is that transitional justice has become very partisan led. It's not national. It hasn't found a way into the national visioning where it's a shared process. It's a bipartisan sort of initiative that is embraced by both sides of the aisle. So you have across West Africa in countries that experience transitional justice, countries that have layered transitional justice, you tend to see that it has become a legacy issue for one or two political parties. And even though it has become a legacy issue for one or two political parties, that legacy was largely driven by needs of expediency. It
mm,
wasn't envisioned as a choice that was necessary. It wasn't envisioned as a choice that that was important for everyone. So basically, what I'm saying here is that that need for a common ground with transitional justice hasn't been forged. That consensus among political actors across the aisle to say we can disagree with every other thing, but the issue of human rights, the issue of justice, this is the common ground. This is really what we all want in transforming Liberia and transforming. I mentioned in Sierra Leone because I grew up as a young kid out of university. Sierra Leone TRC experience was the first reference to my learning. And you heard 1 week ago there was there was an attempted coup. This reinforces my point about partisan, how transitional justice is mostly partisan driven for such a remarkable experience as Sierra Leone to be now in a balance. This is the first serious attempt to disruptive peace process since the Lome Peace Agreement in
mm,
1999. Sierra Leone has not come this close to the use of force removing a democratically elected government. Well, I want to say democratically elected cautiously because I know part of the hostilities 1 week earlier is about the end of the June elections and all of that. So I want to be cautious in saying democratically elected government. But I'm trying to make the point about why transitional justice agenda in Africa, in Liberia, or in the Mana River region is partisan driven. It's not bipartisan yet. And so part of the challenge is not having all political actors embracing the idea of how can we deal with the past by having this part of the national vision process. So that's one of the big challenges. See, those are some of the challenges, human rights, transitional justice, and the whole spectrum of justice related issues. It has become led on the basis of expediency, has become led based on particular need of a political party at the time. It's not been envisioned as one common solution for a whole country over time. So that's what I see as one of the big problems.
I think it's interesting that you bring that aspect up. I mean, there is, transitional justice, its own internal crises, right? People working in sort of silos and not necessarily trying to either decentralize the process or try to unify and create a solidified body. But I think also showing that just outside of the practice of transitional justice, the political dynamics that go into it, right? The politicization of it. And I think when we see the criticisms of transitional justice being this short-term project versus a longer-term project, looking at the actual political environment in which it functions, you can actually see how that actually ends up being and how that actually starts to shape its identity. I think that's definitely quite an applicable challenge that we see across the continent. And I'm glad that you also brought in the element of the Sierra Leone, sort of crisis with the coup and how that actually ends up having repercussions in the future. So Right now, what would you say are the initiatives that you're currently working on to make transitional justice an everyday dialogue and a practice? Especially now that we've just spoken about, how it becomes a partisan issue.
Yeah.
And we've just reflected on your time actually developing what transitional justice means to you during the process of writing a book, and also what it meant for you and, sort of your country in Liberia. What initiatives today in the contemporary are you working on to make it a, continuous sort of dialogue?
So I'm working on a host of different. I'm involved with a number of different projects. Back home in Liberia, there is Duga Institute, a think tank established by Liberian researchers. So I'm working there as a fellow. I'm running the transitional justice segment of this think tank. My work on the think tank is essentially around leading scholarship on some of the unfinished business of the Truth and Reconciliation Mission. Mostly, my area of specialization is trying to interrogate grassroots memorialization of political violence perpetrated through sites of massacres. I'm particularly fascinated about how communities that are either situated over mass grave or over sites of massacre, how have that experience over time socially re-engineer the way they see the life of themselves, they see the life of the community, and what demands are these communities making of government. So I'm involved with grassroots related memorialization projects. I'm involved with grassroots related advocacy with government on issues of the war crimes, establishing a war crimes court. On the other hand, I'm also working along with other activists in campaigning for the establishment of the War Crimes Court. Now, on this note of the War Crimes Court, I come from a practice where I believe that one particular measure of the transitional justice rubric does not have the capacity to address a complex or multi-layer problem as you see in Liberia. I think that a cross-section of the transitional justice toolkit is applicable in a context such as Liberia. And I make this point deliberately so that back home in Liberia, some of my colleagues think that if a war crimes code is set up today and you grab a few persons here, try them, they're found guilty, they are in prison, put away for life, and then that is going to address Liberia's problem. No, it's not. It's just one of the 4 or 5 choices within the toolbox of the transitional justice process that could potentially contribute to deterrence of future violence. I think, as I mentioned earlier, there's the issue of memorialization, how the community reflect, learn from its past in the forms of how museums are packaged, in the forms of how community, ordinary community, create new civic spaces through memorialization projects that are especially meant to teach the younger generation about what really happened, about yesterday's violence, and how is it present in today's Liberia. This is so much applicable in Liberia, where 70% of the population are those who are 30 years and below. So you see that majority of Liberians alive today have no lived experience of what the conflict was about or what the violence was about. You have an aging 30% of the Liberian population that saw the violence, that lived through it. Part of my work in Liberia is to engage policymakers and say, hey, we're running out of time. You have a whole new generation born after the peace agreement. That's 20 years ago. That there is no history books written because of the politics. I mentioned earlier about the partisan driven transitional justice agenda in Liberia. There is no comprehensive history on the war. There's no comprehensive history on the conflict that will serve as a foundation for the new generation to read about in a more systematic way and know what is happening. My advocacy is pretty much as part of this process to see how a new government, well, hopefully we have Joseph Boakai. He might be that person, who knows, that might finally make a decision to say, yes, we need to have a history text that teaches the younger generation about what the conflict was about. Part of my work is in that direction, trying to advocate for general and comprehensive history. In the absence of that, you have the danger where memory, violent memories of the conflict is transmitted to an unsuspecting younger generation. It goes with a moral protest to act And with such conditioning, there are grounds for future conflict in a context such as Liberia, where a younger generation has no basis to appreciate what the conflict was about. He grows up in a household where he's been fed with memories that are unfiltered, memories that are in itself poisonous. That's the room for future conflict, in my own assessment. So that's one of the second area I'm working on, and then I'm affiliated with a social lab that is doing work on corporate accountability. This is more on the African continent and between Latin America. This social laboratory it brings together African practitioners and scholars and Latin American and activists as well as international lawyers from the US. We've been meeting over the last 2 years trying to identify practical ways of holding multinational corporations to account for their actions around business and human rights. The tendency has been mostly to hold warring factions accountable in post conflict setting, leaving multinational corporations unchecked. In the Liberian TRC process, there are recommendations on economic crimes. The Liberian TRC was one of the first few truth commission that tried to explore the issue of economic crimes, the correlation with how civil wars are prolonged and how multinational corporations benefit from the informal economy that the war creates as a result of this. So I'm part of this social lab, as we call it, and we're exploring South-South collaboration on how do we hold multinational corporations involved. So in summary, my work is both domestic and international, working with a range of different actors across the continent and across the global south, as well as partnering with colleagues, international lawyers in the global north. So this is just in broad strokes, insight into what exactly I do. Yeah.
I'm actually glad you touched on the issue of youth and violent memories, especially the youth who, don't grow up with necessarily a very tangible experience of what the conflict must have been like. And the reason I say so is because, one of the things, for instance, during my observation that kept coming up was, the youth are the ones that are the agitators of conflict. The youth are the ones who are going to potentially make everything go kaboom without a specific sort of actual discussion on, who or what makes the youth do that, or who feeds them the information of that. How then do you facilitate these kinds of dialogues with the youth at the grassroots level that you've mentioned? It'd be great to see how, you've done that, how you've in the work tried to prevent this sort of violent memory kind of aspect from actually occurring or taking root.
Involving youth in these local processes. So there's clearly tension. From my research, I've been able to establish there are tensions from the ground. On the one hand, you have communities that are creating these, engaged with these memorialization projects. They feel very protective of the memory that they lived through, and protective so much so that they want youth, rather than being involved in the process, to be spectators to this process of memory making. They are like gatekeepers to what was essentially what others have discussed and described as an autobiographical memory. And you have the young, someone who is age 20, 21, doesn't really know what it was about. So having young kids come in and ask questions, I've had an experience where an elder had to scold a young person. I mean, he was very intolerant to having the kids ask very curious questions. And he saw in that questioning a sort of being dismissive. I didn't see it that way. So this is on the one hand, you have that. On the other hand, you have these grassroots settings in Liberia. I'm not so sure about Sierra Leone. They're very prescriptive in terms of traditional roles. There's a lot of seniority in terms of where is the youth place and where is the elderly person's place. And these sort of traditionally assigned roles are in and of itself very problematic. And then you also have the third major problem is that the Civil War destroyed the level of recognition, the level of reverence that elders in communities have. part of the reasons where elders were perceived as some of the organizers of the Civil War. And so you do not have what the relationship that existed prior to the war, where young people look up to their elders for direction, look up to them. So you don't really have that. So we have a social environment that is a little deformed. It's a little deformed. So that's why I think you need government to play a more central role in trying to mediate, in trying to have the elders and the young negotiate a space that works for them. That works for them. Otherwise, you will have an elderly person say, "Hey, you never lived through this. I know this, and I have all of the right to tell you what it is." But the young person is inheriting that memory. That memory is now part of his reality, however remote it might be. It is now reshaping his life. So you have all of that, and then more so, you went to Liberia, you observed the elections. You now have where elections are used, members are being used as weapons in some contexts where a whole ethnic group is now building a consensus on who to vote for and who not to vote for. These members of however problematic these members are, they've been redeployed and, as political tool in selecting who becomes president. And what is interesting about this memory being used in electoral politics is that it is creating a certain social memory in the process. And there's a memory formations ongoing, and you have young kids, too young to understand, have just been told simplistic narratives about what the conflict was about, narratives that cannot stand up to scrutiny. But in an ethnic setting, that narrative is enough to have someone make up his mind. So what we have here, you have young people taking on so much, where schools 20 years after the conflict are now teaching standard Liberian text, standard Liberian history text on the conflict that is more object that is more objective, it's more critical. You don't have that. We do not have a national museum where it is packaged with all of the right emotions to have people being thoughtful about the recent experience. We do not have. They require civic spaces to troubleshoot some of the bias narrative that is being passed around. So you have the picture I'm trying to paint here is that you have a younger generation that is largely unguided, moving into the future, that is unguided about what the recent history was about, what the recent violence was about. So as I mentioned before, as a result of that, we have a situation where there is a meta conflict of what I describe as a conflict over what the conflict is about. There is a conflict of what the conflict is about. So you have the youth playing into that and more or less just regurgitating what they've heard, what their parents raised them on, what the ethnic community have held onto as this memory. And this is what we know. And so that's essentially the narrative that the majority of the youth in Liberia are growing up on, and that's problematic.
I think it's interesting how you touched on that sort of tension between the younger generation, older generation, people who lived through it and who haven't, the miscommunication, the misinformation that comes out of it. Actually, that sort of silence and not actually addressing it through a dialogue can, be grounds for politicization, especially in the absence of a more central place to gain information. And I think in my little experience of Liberia, for instance, it's that one library in Montserrat. It's a national museum. It's got the history of the country getting established, that, relationship between sort of slave descendants coming back and indigenous people in Liberia clashing, and then a very, very tiny section on the actual civil wars. And then you move, and I think I sort of see what you mean by, there is, for something that has made up a very large part of how, even the younger generation that didn't experience the war are experiencing their daily lives today, is not more spoken about. I think that's quite interesting. And I guess that brings me to, with all these grassroots initiatives that you're working on, your continued research and study of sort of the conflict in Liberia, and you did draw like a very interesting relationship between the international work as well as domestic work and how that works together. What's motivating you? What keeps you going? What's the thing that you're like, yeah.
Yeah. So great question. I think what motivates me, part of my work it comes from a place of anger in a way. I mean, I'm angry with the way Liberia has been perceived, the way Liberia has been projected out there. I mean, if you take, for example, you are at an international airport, and my work takes me around quite a bit. So, and I have done this in so many different parts of the world. Someone sees you and say, "Hey, where are you from?" I say, "Well, I'm Liberian." Someone's asked, "Where is Liberia?" And I'm having this conversation with an African person, and I say, "Well, where is Liberia?" And I just start to describe Liberia. Some of them barely know. And if the ones who remember what Liberia is, his knowledge is largely limited. It's shaped by what the 14 years of the Civil War is, child soldiers, the brutality of the Civil War, the destructions of the Civil War. Liberians are refugees in Ghana, Liberians are refugees in Sierra Leone and Cote d'Ivoire. But that's more a byproduct of a recent political violence. So Liberia goes further back. And this is really what I'm really motivated about, to let people know that there is a bigger story here. There is a more beautiful and remarkable story about Liberia, not just as a country, but Liberia more as an idea. Liberia was established in 1822 as an idea, as an outpost for free black men, as a diaspora for black people everywhere. Liberia represents an idea at the time of black redemption. It was one space during the period when no other country on the continent had an independence, when no other country when much of Africa was still in the clutches of colonialism. Liberia was there. The debut E.B. Du Bois making back and forth missions to Liberia, he was preoccupied with the potential of Liberia. That Liberia represented the index case for Black self-determination. You have Marcus Garvey on the other end, engaging with the Liberian Authority and explore different solutions, different possibilities, and how Liberia can be used as the big example for the rest of the continent. In more contemporary time, in 1964, you have Nelson Mandela making his first visit to Liberia to raise money for the ANC Youth League. Koto with Sizwe. And he was giving, I think, if I recall correctly, President Tokman gave him $10,000 and said 5,000 is for you personally, and this other 5,000 is for Albert Sutuli, then the head of the ANC. Mandela writes in his Long Walk to Freedom, a memoir, and said, in his whole life, this was the first time he ever received personally such a huge sum of money. He writes amusingly to that memory of visiting Liberia for the first time. So I'm really fascinated about how domestic problem in a country can overwhelm its international image. All people remember today about what Liberia is the recent crisis of a civil war, is the recent crisis of 1980 when the military took over, and all that has happened in the sub-region has suffered in terms of refugee, in terms of Liberia domestic problem. Not many people know Liberia is a founding member of the OAU that is now to the AU. You have Nkrumah meeting in Liberia in 1979. You have Sekou Touré meeting in Liberia in 1979. You had the South Sudanese diaspora who were given Liberian passports to stay in Liberia. You have South Africans, Hugh Masekela, stay in Liberia for several years. Miriam Makeba, stay in Liberia. Nina Simon, stay in Liberia. So part of my work, is to minimize this level of domestic problem, or is to ensure that the consensus on Liberia domestic problem is minimized to the extent possible, where we're able to revive Liberia international image. And talking about dealing with the past is to reclaim the purpose, the national purpose of what Liberia was, and not to be defined as a country that has populated much of West Africa with refugees. This is a very important personal mission for me because recent studies suggest that by 2050, 50% of Africans that will be alive will be those 18 years and below. So you see, the youth birth, is not stopping anytime soon. I mean, we are dealing with a problem where there is little known about African history in general. I'm just using Liberia as an anecdotal case of how distant history foundational history of what Africa was before, pre-colonial Africa. It's all being lost in time. And what we have today is reducing countries such as Liberia to the recent past, reducing countries, the Liberia to the recent 14 years of civil war in Liberia. My work, what drives me, is to find a breach between the domestic problem and help to repair Liberia international image so that people realize that Liberia has paid its dues. And this is what Liberia did before. Unfortunately, because of internal problems, this is where Liberia is today. And so part of my work is dealing with work on memories and memorialization back in Liberia is to also bring back memories of what Liberia was, what Liberia was established to do, what's its Liberian national purpose, or what was Liberian national purpose, and how that purpose was fulfilled and how it's being fulfilled today. So all of that motivates me. I'm sometimes very frustrated. I'm sometimes very angry about how the world is sometimes just aware of negative things, but not aware of the good things that, especially for a country that was at the foundation of post-colonial Africa, part of the foundation of the redemption of Africa in lots of different ways. So, in a nutshell, this is really what gets me up and running and doing all that I do.
Hmm. I think, you've really touched on some very important parts because, we've sort of come through in our conversation the issue of silo treatment of transitional justice. And what you've brought out now is how the actual history of a country and the relationship it has had, the connections it has had to other countries matter for the overall sort of healing process, but also matter for the way that we become represented post that conflict. 'Cause I think it's not touched on enough what representation and what image look like in the aftermath of conflict. And I think your motivations definitely speak to that. They definitely speak to how, and I think I even wrote it down like pre-colonial Africa is lost in time, like how
Yeah,
all of the good things, all of the happenings, the events, even post the conflict, the fact that when you look up Liberia, you see, whoa, 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 but you don't actually see how since then, there has been such a great concerted effort amongst everyone to just try and rebuild with whatever is there to just try and, get some things together. It's not
yeah,
necessarily perfect. It doesn't look like, metropolitan New York, but it definitely looks like people rallied together and
yeah.
tried to make the best of the worst situation. And I think that's definitely something to keep having a dialogue about, to keep trying to rebuild even that, Africa to Africa sort of relationship as these things to connect. I mean, I didn't even know Nelson Mandela actually went to
It
Liberia.
is.
This is
It
like
is.
shocking news for
In
me. I'm
1964.
like, oh my goodness. Wow.
It is.
But that's exactly what the role of history writing and memory writing, memory representation looks like, right? It's bringing things into just beyond this specific time frame. So I think, yeah, that's really just been the passion for me actually to hear you say that, to talk about that representation. So as we move forward, as we are thinking now about the new year, what are the issues and concerns we should be focusing on in transitional justice generally, but also in sort of the development of politics in the continent for transitional justice?
I think the Africa Transitional Justice, like I said, the Africa Transitional Justice Framework document is a good start. It took a while, and we all know where the AU has been in terms of its own reflection on transitional justice. It was mostly concerned with what is the motivation of this, and so it was steady over time. And we now have a policy framework. And just to make a connection with what I said earlier, and I think this connection here is how can the policy framework of the AU be used to really inspire and move partisan politics, transitional justice driven agenda to bipartisan politics? How can this framework document be used as a rallying point in parliament, as a rallying point in legislative agenda making? How can it? Because we're dealing with an impasse every time there's a transition from one administration to the next. You do not have that common ground. You do not have that consensus in terms of what is the future of transitional justice. We're dealing with multiple layers of transitional justice processes being aborted, being sacrificed over other choices, development choices that I perceive to be a little more expedient, that seem to be a little more attractive to the politics of the day. So I think the African Union Transitional Justice policy framework holds great potential. How to use it, the traditional method of domesticating. I mean, I did some work in Sierra Leone about a year ago, and there's an organization that is working with Parliament trying to domesticate that. But should we go beyond that? Should we make these domesticated processes, in my view, sounds very mechanical. It's like dealing with any other instrument that goes through the process of domestication. But how can legislative agenda setting go on retreats, go on process where these sort of instruments are broken down and politicians get to see it in all of its essential parts for really what it's worth, so that personally parliamentarians can own it and say, yes, I see in this the future of Liberia, I see in this the future of Sierra Leone, I see in this, and this is bigger than just any one political party. It took the African Union quite a long time to be involved with this. I remember I was part of a project with the CSVR some 3, 4 years ago. We were all asked to write case studies on colonialism, the legacy of colonialism, and how it may be inhibiting or enhancing transitional justice in different countries. We were African scholars. I wrote the case study for Liberia. I had a colleague from Mozambique, some from Algeria, other from the DR Congo. It was a very interesting cohort of African scholars that came together to really reflect on this. All of this became the foundation for the AU, some of the briefing the AU received. So if you read the forward, if you read the background note to the AU TJP, it's all about trying to decolonize TJ and try to sit transitional justice within the context of Africa, and so that it is part of the whole African solution for African problem. My view is that we need to go beyond just that. The approach in country has to be thought through, has to be deliberate, and has to connect with parliamentarians so that they get to own it and see long beyond. This is not just the ordinary party politics. So I think the future of transitional justice, dealing with some of the challenges I talk about, is in lots of ways possible with the way we engage with the transitional justice framework of the AU. That's really what I think.
I think it's interesting that you touch on that, because there is the whole, debate and discourse about transitional justice being this apolitical, ahistorical model, this thing that you put in, it works a particular way, it's going to have a particular effect. But I think what you're touching on shows that actually the work of transitional justice is inherently political, because the conflicts that we're dealing with are political by their very nature. And to draw on the policies, the African Union Transitional Justice Policy specifically, to draw on it and to actually adapt it in a way that connects with the issues and the concerns that parliamentarians have and policymakers have, would essentially, I suppose, bring it home, make it more contextual, make it less about a photo op, but, and essentially localize it. So I guess, thank you for that. But I suppose that brings us to the end of our lovely chat. Thank you so much, Aaron. I really appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Yeah, we fought for this time, eh?
Yeah, and thanks for these very thoughtful questions that I think they're very good reading of the continent, where the content is today and where it's going. And yeah, thank you. And I'm glad to see the network is doing a great job. Thank you for having me.
No worries. No, thanks, Aaron.